Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to start off by acknowledging the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the lands on which I live and work, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with us today who have joined this launch. Before I start, I also wanted to just go through a couple of housekeeping issues. Can I ask that all microphones are switched to mute? And I noticed that I think everyone has done that. Thank you. The launch consists of two parts. First, we will hear from our 4 guest speakers who will then form our panel in the second part of the launch. If you do have any questions, please add them to the chat, or you can raise your hand or virtual hand when we get to the question, when we get to the second part of the launch. My name is Marg Camilleri. I'm from Federation University, and I would also like to introduce my co-editor and colleague, Dr. Alistair Harkness. I would also like to acknowledge that Dr. Kyle Mulrooney from UNE is also assisting us behind the scenes. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you all for joining us for the launch of our edited book. I see that many of you are joining us from various states and territories across Australia. In particular, I wanted to acknowledge that we are joined today by the Honourable Justice Jenny Blokland and the Honourable Justice Glenn Martin AM. Both have generously agreed to assist us with the launch, and I thank them for that. I would also like to acknowledge that Magistrate Payne from the Cairns Magistrate Court has also joined us here this evening. Welcome, Jacqueline. I also welcome Professor Lisa Waller from RMIT and Associate Professor Joe McIntyre from the University of South Australia, who are also contributing to this launch. So we're very fortunate to have 4 wonderful speakers helping us tonight. Welcome also to the many contributors, academics and practitioners who were able to join us. And of course, I welcome other guests and thank you for your interest in this book. Before we formally introduce the speakers, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about the rationale for this edited book, Australian Courts, Controversies and Challenges. The idea emerged from searching for suitable readings for our undergraduate criminology and criminal justice students learning about the Australian courts or courts in Australia. While there are many fine publications about specific courts, there didn't appear to be a consolidated collection which brought together the many varied contemporary issues confronting courts and court users, let alone one which balances the academic and practitioner perspectives of how these challenges are understood and experienced in practice by real people. The volume brings these understandings and experiences from multiple courts across several states and territory jurisdictions. The chapters uniquely shed light on the varied challenges faced by the courts, including, to name a few, either through dealing with delays, righting wrongs, responding to family violence, or ensuring that the spaces, environments and practices of the courts are culturally safe. Importantly, the chapters not only identify the challenges, they also outline opportunities for reform. Over to you, Alistair.
Well, thanks so much, Marg, and can I join you in welcoming everybody along here today, but paying particular acknowledgement to those people who have joined us who have contributed to the book. I think this is the 7th book that I've been involved in editing, and there's always been a few little issues and conundrums and fires to extinguish as we go. And we haven't had that on this occasion, and I'd like to think that it's because of our excellent editing skills. But the truth is that it's really because we've had such a stellar lineup of people who have contributed to the book, both academics, but also the practitioners who have contributions accompanying each of the chapters that has made it such a smooth process. I think before I introduce our first speaker, I'd just also like to acknowledge Mark's leadership of this project and the impeccable organisational skills that she's brought to marshalling everybody and making sure that it's come to fruition. I think one other person to signal as well, or to single out as well, is Dr. Rachel Hale, who a colleague of ours from Federation University, formerly, who took an interregnum to work in the Department of Justice on a really important project, and has now just recently returned to academia. But she really was quite instrumental in helping shape and structure the project in its infancy as we got going.
She was absolutely, Alistair, thank you for remembering to acknowledge Rachel. She played a really important part.
And one last person to acknowledge as well is our commissioning editor at Palgrave, Josie Taylor, and her team, who have made this a smooth running process as well. And so, without any further ado, let me introduce our first guest speaker. The Honourable Jenny Blokland was appointed a judge of the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory in April of 2010. And not only that role, but many others as well. Jenny is currently the National President of the Australian Institute of Judicial Administration, a council member of the Australian Judicial Officers Association, a former council member of the Judicial Council on Cultural Diversity, and she is also a fellow of the Australian Academy of Law. Justice Blokland has published widely, is heavily involved in numerous organisations and associations. And in fact, I crossed paths first, it must have been back in 2016, Jenny, when we invited you to join the very first book, looking at rural criminology and crime in Australia, and you produced a perspective on the courts and their operation in the remote parts of the territory. And I must say, and Kyle will attend to this too, because it is a set reading for our students at UNE, that constantly levels of high excitement and eye-opening experiences as well in reading that contribution. So thank you very much for that. And I'll pass over to you to say a few words. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, both Marg Camilleri and Alistair Harkness. Thank you for the invitation to be part of the launch today of Australian Courts, Controversies, Challenges and Change. Now, as I just mentioned while we were chatting before, I'm coming to you from Alice Springs. I'm here for a month, so I'm on Arrernte country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today at this virtual launch. Also remembering the top end of my territory today, Northern Territory, a sad time for people in Arnhem Land with the loss of the leader of the Gumatj, Yunupingu. So feeling for people up there as well. I've also taken to heart Marg Camilleri's dedication to her son, who took his life a few years ago. And I will, Marg, make sure that I donate to one of those suicide support services. Congratulations to all of the authors, especially to the editors and authors themselves, Marg Camilleri and Alistair Harkness, for editing and bringing this book together. This will, I think, be a really useful book for practitioners, judicial officers, and indeed, I think, for policy makers and people that work behind the scenes, perhaps as much as in the courts. Of course, Marg and Alistair, you've also both written chapters. Obviously, the first chapter, Context and Controversies, which sets the scene for the many chapters that come after that, and the final chapter, Challenging Court Landscapes and Opportunities for Change. That final chapter really packs a punch too, looking at questions like geography and its impact. And Alistair, as you mentioned, I know that that's an interest of yours in rural criminology. I mean, we probably say more regional, remote and very remote here, but that to me impacts so significantly on all services that can be given to people in remote areas, but also how the courts operate and what the restrictions are sometimes on courts there. There's also interest in challenging our biases that comes out from that final chapter. and some summaries about all the problems of dealing with social media, which are, of course, examined more fully in some of the other chapters. The whole question of open justice, which has been put under strain in some jurisdictions, the essence of fair trial, and especially there's an emphasis on First Peoples. And certainly with the geography that gets emphasised from time to time, and First Peoples, certainly someone who's out in the country a lot, I think, you know, we see all these very interesting programs that are obviously helpful to people in more populated centres, and they just are much harder to deliver, if at all, in very remote places. Marg Camilleri's also written an illuminating chapter on victims' participatory rights. And I think there is a great public interest in that subject. And Alistair, you've introduced us to broader themes that I think really do force us to think more broadly, at least, about the context that we're operating in as courts. For instance, to think more broadly about the sorts of issues that come up in politics and parliament. And then there is that related chapter, which I found really fascinating, of Simon Finn on the role of a parliamentarian. I know, you know, we, I suppose our closest connection really to parliaments in the courts is looking at legislation and the product of their work, but we don't often hear about what it's like to work with all the competing demands that a parliamentarian works with. So I found that really fascinating. But congratulations especially on bringing all of these authors together on so many diverse subjects. I know that often Chief Justices and Chief Magistrates talk about herding cats when dealing with judicial officers, but just looking at the diversity of the authors is really fascinating. I don't know how you did all of that, but judicial officers, academics, practicing lawyers, former politicians. So it's actually one of the first things that strikes me about the book is the sheer diversity of the authors, and then the topics that come out as a result of that. It really is striking. That said, there's some very interesting and I think useful technical work that's done in this book, particularly in the area of suppression orders. So there's a lot of, as we like to put it sometimes, black letter law learnings going on there. But there's also a lot of conceptual and observational and some experiential work that is really, I think, useful to reflect on, especially the work of that's been done and is featured at the very start of the book, Indigenous Sentencing Courts, Elena Marchetti and Linda Ryle. And on the Murray Court, Jackie Payne, I'm really glad to hear that she's at the launch today. I think it's really something to really go into another judge's shoes, as it were, and see what it's like to administer justice in a court such as the Murray Court, and Jackie's unique perspective on all of that. I really enjoyed those chapters. Then the book goes into more the problem-solving courts, continues with some issues for First Peoples, and what I hadn't read much about, but is very of the moment in the NT, not that I'm involved in it myself, but First Peoples and colonial processes. and what needs to happen there to make those processes culturally safe and allow for greater participation. And you have the chapters there from Allison, Cunneen, Longman and Whitaker. So a book about courts doesn't necessarily strike one as being terribly exciting. There aren't actually that many books in Australia that are dedicated to courts. I do occasionally need to sometimes look up Crawford on Australian courts, that our dear, now deceased, unfortunately, former professor of law at a number of universities in Australia, and then a judge himself on the ICJ, but one of his earlier works was Australian courts. But that's all very technical, useful sometimes. I often find I need to look up the meaning of accrued jurisdiction. Hint, hint, it's apparently something that creeps up on you, accrued jurisdiction. So outside of those sort of more technical and practical guides to Australian courts, I find them quite dated actually, but there's not much that reflects the contemporary diversity that is reflected in this book through a number of different courts, these entrenched complex problems such as domestic and interspousal violence, the implications of tough on crime, tough on bail. We've just gone through another cycle of that in the NT. Something that I, to my shame, don't think about that much outside of the usual court structures is the whole question of redress for wrongful conviction. And I found the chapters on that quite challenging. I wondered once again whether in a small jurisdiction and the other smaller jurisdictions, those jurisdictions can actually afford to have some other body that investigates wrongful convictions. But the minute that we think it doesn't happen very often or that we have enough safeguards, I think you read these chapters and realise, well, actually, we've clocked up some shockers in Australia, my jurisdiction included. The disappearing nature of civil justice is also something that I think about from time to time. And once again, it might have hit small jurisdictions in a more intense way. But certainly Joe McIntyre, who I understand is here today as well, and Ben Doyle and Stephen McDonald's chapters cover a bit about the importance of the civil jurisdictions, but really the fact that it's disappearing from the courts at a great rate, I might say, in a court like ours. Everything tribunals now, if that, and most people can't afford to litigate in a court. The chapters on young people, it struck me that it was all about keeping people out of our courts. And certainly I feel quite ashamed about our whole Dondale issue that's occurred over here, and the problem of institutions that deal with children all around the country. But certainly the work on young people, Rosemary Sheehan, Susan Bidet and Laura Chipp, is, I think, really useful. I also think the bibliographies are going to be useful. Some of them are incredibly detailed at the end of each chapter, because most of the chapters have a go further, but wait, there's more type of conclusion to them. So I think that it's great that for those who want to or need to, we can look further as well in really comprehensive bibliographies. So I think that this book is going to represent a genuine grappling with courts in contemporary Australia and from a wide range of perspectives. It's a genuine contribution to the literature on courts, and I certainly hope that I find a way to promote it through the AIJA, perhaps starting with a mention in our newsletter. So can I congratulate all of you that have been involved in it? There's actually more things I could say, but I must cut out time and everything. So I really do congratulate all of you, and I look forward to seeing it in hard copy and so forth, if it's going to be available that way. And I'll look forward to hearing what others have to say today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you for your kind words as well. I really appreciate that, and thank you for a wonderful overview of the book, actually. I'm glad we've recorded that because some really salient words there. The book is available in hard copy, and for those who attend the launch tonight, there's going to be a discount code available for you as well. First of all, I'd like to introduce Justice Martin, who is our next speaker. The Honourable Justice Glenn Martin, AM. Justice Martin is a Senior Judge Administrator of the Supreme Court of Queensland. In 1979, Justice Martin was admitted as a barrister of the Supreme Court of Queensland and was appointed as Senior Counsel in 1998. His Honour was also admitted as a barrister in Western Australia, the Northern Territory and the Solomon Islands, and has appeared in the Supreme Courts of those jurisdictions. Justice Martin was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in 2013 for a significant service to the law, particularly through contributions to the Australian Bar Association and to the community of Queensland. He serves in numerous capacities in various organisations, and it's a great pleasure to introduce him to you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marg, and thank you and Alistair for inviting me to take part in tonight's proceedings. I have to say I do feel a little like the second judge on a full bench, where I say that I agree with Justice Blokland and have nothing to add, but she's relieved me of quite a few things because of her excellent overview. What I would like to do, though, is just make a few points about this type of study that's been put together. And that is that until about, say, 20 years ago, the broad field of study about judicial decision-making and the role of courts within Australia's society had received a light and inconsistent tilling. The learning on the subject was lean. We could have recourse to the endless and footnote-ridden articles by hungry academics in the United States. That was usually an unsatisfying endeavour. Sometimes you could look to pronouncements made from on high, usually recorded in the Law Quarterly Review, but they were generally to the effect that everything was all right and had been since the passing of the Judicature Acts. In Australia, when it came to the role of judges and the way in which they should approach their task and the way in which the courts fitted into the society in Australia and the branches of government, a common response was simply to quote Sir Owen Dixon and his well-known remarks when he was sworn in about the application of a strict and complete legalism. And for many, that seemed to be the end of the debate. I should mention that when I was thinking about what I might say tonight, I went back to that speech, which, as most of you would know, is in the collection called Jesting Pilot. And I went to the index to see what had been collected from Sir Owen's many speeches and papers about judges. I went to the index. I went to the heading Judges. And the first item under that was infirmities of judicial minds. Now, you'll understand that excited my interest, and I went to the reference. It was a paper he gave in 1933 to the Medico-Legal Society. He said, "The infirmities of each judicial mind are fully understood at the bar, which finds a source of innocent pleasure, if not pride, in their exploitation." Now, whether or not the judicial infirmities he spoke of have been explored in this book, I'll leave to others to consider. He did go on to say that the fall before which such a pride goeth takes place on appeal. That still occurs. The observation then that I wish to make is that the type of analysis which is evident in this book was rare until the turn of the century. Many of the authors whose works are collected in this anthology have published elsewhere and have been in the forefront of the exploration of those issues which have for so long been touched upon but not wrestled with. And I see that wrestling taking place in so many chapters of this book. And I should say that it has had an immediate effect for me, because a matter has come up, and I won't say what it's about, but I turned to the chapter by Jane Goodman-Delahunty and David Tate about juries and social media. You may guess, therefore, that I'm grappling with that, and whether it goes any further is a matter yet to be decided. But it did assist me considerably. So the value of this collection, I think, is that it performs a task which judges in the main don't have the time to undertake. The capacity of a judge or a magistrate in any busy court to reflect upon the role they perform is extremely limited. Take, for example, a magistrate who has to deal with somewhere between 100 and sometimes 300 mentions in a day. They are not likely to want to then, at 6 o'clock at night, think about their role in society. They're more likely thinking about how soon is it decent for me to go to bed and get some proper rest. So this publication engages in the type of analysis which allows a judicial officer the luxury of having someone else research, analyse, and provide a prognosis in those areas which would otherwise fall outside the sightlines of a busy judge or busy judicial officer, especially those who never see the bottom of an in-tray. I've already gained some valuable insights from the chapters I've read. Jenny has outlined them in a succinct and excellent fashion, and I won't go over those again. But those insights I have gained have proved useful to me, and I know that my continued observation of the matters in the book will continue to provide the insights which will make this the excellent resource for judicial officers, which I think it already is. So thank you very much.
Terrific, and thank you so much for those words, Justice Martin. It's really much appreciated. We're now going to move to the first of two contributors to speak about their particular chapters. We've deliberately chosen two quite different chapters and contributors of those. Our first of the contributors, so our third speaker tonight, is Professor Lisa Waller. Her contribution, along with Katrina Clifford in chapter 4, teases apart some of those issues around the concept of open justice, a matter brought forward in our mind's eyes during and following the COVID pandemic particularly. Lisa is a professor and Associate Dean of Communication in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT University in Melbourne, and is a research associate at the Centre for Rural Criminology with us at the University of New England as well. Her research investigates how the news media shapes a range of social domains, including with the justice system. So I pass over now to Lisa to share her comments.
Thanks, Alistair. I'd just like to begin by saying that controversies, challenges and change have been very inspiring themes to work through in preparing the chapter. But this evening, I've been thinking about two other words beginning with C, and that's collaboration and also context. And so I'd just like to congratulate you and Marg on your wonderful collaboration, which has brought us all here together. I have to say that I really enjoyed the opportunity to work with my colleagues, Katrina Clifford and Danny Tran, who people in Victoria might know from seeing him on ABC TV, where he worked for a long time as a court reporter. So it was great to be able to join forces with both of them to think through some of the controversies, challenges and change taking place in the relationship between the courts and the news media. And I guess that brings us to context, because for all of us who have been involved in this fantastic project, we've been dealing with the context of another thing beginning with C, which is COVID-19. And certainly where, well, not only journalism and news media are concerned, but digital technologies and communication technologies like the platform we're using this evening became quite a big part of the criminal justice system. And so it was great to have Danny's insights of what it was like as a reporter to be working, you know, in a very busy Melbourne court system during the pandemic. And I think his observation that courts became more accessible, but perhaps less open to the media was a really great one. It was something I hadn't really thought about. And I guess that's the thing with collaboration and working on a project like this, is that we might be working in similar areas, but it's been great to share different points of view and experiences in bringing the chapters together. Certainly in terms of controversies, when you are a journalist, or you're someone like me who likes to examine what's going on with news media, controversy is never far away. And there's another C word, which is conflict, perhaps the most important news value of them all, and possibly why courts are such a rich ground for journalists to find stories to report upon. We had lots of different controversies to choose from in thinking about how we talk about news media. And we had two big ones that I'm sure people here have found very interesting. The first is the Pell case, and that incredible tension between the right to a fair trial and the public's right to know what's going on, which I haven't got time to go into now. I hope people will have a look at the chapter. But it's a really good case for thinking through, you know, where the balance ought to lie in those two competing and really important ideas. The second case we looked at, and Jenny touched on, issues with juvenile justice and detention in the Northern Territory. We looked at the Voller defamation case, and that really interesting question of who is a publisher in an online era. And I guess one of the arguments we've tried to make through the chapter is that media law can sometimes be a little bit on the slow side when it comes to the digital age. But we can also see that courts can respond very quickly, as they had to during COVID-19. So, you know, there are some interesting things going on there too. We begin our chapter by reflecting a little bit on that very important concept of open justice. But it was really interesting by the time we got to the end of our part of the project, because Danny's final reflection is in terms of that relationship between the media being the eyes and ears of the public, and also playing a really important role in holding justice to account, is that it's the journalist's responsibility always to be the witness. So hopefully our chapter has played a role, I guess, in bearing witness to some of the really big issues that other people that might be more active players in the system that have contributed to the book are. We're observers to the justice system, and anything more that we might do, as Danny would say, is simply advocacy. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for also mentioning the C word, COVID. There are other things that our contributors have been grappling with over the last couple of years, and that includes floods as well, and a couple of our contributors were homeless for a while, so yet they still managed. I'm not quite sure how, but I thank them for continuing to sort of work on their respective chapters and submitting them to this publication. Thanks, Lisa. Next, I'd like to introduce another contributor, Associate Professor Joe McIntyre, who with practitioners, Ben Doyle, KC, and Stephen McDonald, SC, contributed Chapter 15, the Controversy of Civil Justice. Joe is an Associate Professor in Public Law and Legal Theory at the University of South Australia. His research specialises in judicial theory, the study of courts and how they function in society. He has held teaching posts in Canada and the United Kingdom and Australia. Joe.
Thanks, Marg. Again, I want to endorse Lisa's point that the framing of this in terms of controversy, challenge, change has posed a really interesting way to think about what it is our courts do. I'm something of an outlier here. I'm the civil justice contributor in a book that is largely about the criminal law. And that tension itself is really core to what I talk about in my chapter. You know, nothing captures the public imagination quite like crime. Criminal proceedings dominate public discourse about judicial proceedings. We get the high profile cases. I mean, we just have to look at what's happening in New York in the last 24 hours. Crime makes headlines. In contrast, civil justice really rarely enters into public consciousness. Really, the only form of civil procedure that gets much media attention are those scandalous defamation cases where we've got famous players and deep pockets at play. Unfortunately, this lack of attention has allowed a complacency that, you know, everything's okay to arise about our civil justice. The reality, though, is that when citizens need to turn to civil justice, in most instances, it won't come close to meeting their expectations, because this is a system that is facing an existential crisis. And I endorse Justice Blokland's view that the civil proceedings and civil litigation is disappearing at an astonishing rate. Civil justice is the forgotten twin of our justice system. And that lack of attention too often obscures the parlous health of that system and the significant impact on accessibility and efficiency between resolving disputes with citizens. The fact is that for most citizens, they are far more likely to engage with civil processes than criminal processes, whether a fencing dispute, a planning application, consumer complaints, small claims. As I highlight in the chapter, 1 in 4 Australians will face a serious legal problem every single year that is so serious as to justify speaking to a lawyer. Most of those, the overwhelming majority, are civil matters. So 1 in 4 Australians face a serious legal problem. But only about 1 in 20, about 3 to 4% of those will ever make it into the justice system. Of those that make it into the justice system at all, only about 1% of those will ever be judicially determined. So that's 0.05% of serious legal matters will ever be resolved through a civil justice determination. cost, delay, complexity, inaccessibility operate to really functionally alienate the population from our civil courts. Yeah, as I argue in this paper, our civil justice provide a vital public service, framing and enlivening rights, driving social, political, and economic engagement. As the UK case of Unison highlight, civil justice is a vital public service. It's not a private good, it is a vital public service. But in Australia, we don't have that case that acts as a clarion call. We've got that same core need, but we don't have that same recognition of just how poorly, so existentially struggling the system often is. So that got me really thinking about this chapter. We were asked to think of the biggest controversy and challenge in our context, and that left something of a dilemma, because for there to be a controversy, you really need the public to care. And we've so effectively alienated our population from the justice system that by and large, we can't even meet that threshold. We as academics and practitioners, we're aware of this, but for most of the laity have no idea how this is. So what I argue in this paper is that the biggest controversy facing civil courts is that controversy by omission, the controversy, that there is not a broader social concern and consciousness of that importance of our civil justice system. So what I say is that the largest challenge is engaging the public and politicians with the need for a healthy and accessible civil justice system. We are likely to need some radical changes to deliver a system that's fit for purpose, but a combination of technological, regulatory, and cultural change make that possible. We can imagine a world where we have a functional and effective civil justice system, but that needs to begin with the idea that everybody cares and should have access to this system. And that itself is, unfortunately, a controversial proposition. So again, thank you, Alistair and Marg, for giving me the opportunity to feed these ideas and try and reduce them into writing. And the use of having the practitioner insight has, I think, been a really great foil to bring out those ideas. So it's a really great project, and thank you so much for your work.
Terrific. Thanks, Joe. And thank you for your contribution as well. It's been, like all the other contributions, just made it such well, if I do say so myself, an excellent read. So thank you. Now, I think we've got probably another 10 or 12 minutes for Q&A with our panel, and the panel consists of Joe and Lisa, and also Justice Blokland and Justice Martin. If you have any questions, you can either raise your hand virtually or pose a question in the chat.
Okay, so our first question, Marg, is from Jackie Charles.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for including me in this book launch. It's really pleasing to hear of this work, and I've ordered a copy, and I can't wait to read the insights that you've all discussed. My question is related to what Joe just discussed. In my day job, I'm a clerk of a barrister's chambers, and we predominantly deal with civil justice matters, and there is a glaring and increasing gap between the general public, the profession, the courts, and the operation of the system, which Joe alluded to in his remarks. So my question, I imagine, at first instance is to Joe, is what mechanisms do you think we could institute at this late stage that could potentially arrest what you've discussed? Is there anything you feel we can do as, academics, or in my case, an insider into the system, and perhaps for the judicial officers as well in their capacity, that might remedy some of these issues that you've pointed out?
Great question, Jackie, and thanks for coming along. Good to see you. I think technology will have to play a big part of it. We're seeing these amazing strides in things like the generalized AI that is able to pass a lot of detailed information. But part of that is where does the human matter in the system? And that gets us to reflect on what it is that we need from our courts. Part of what we value from the court is the participatory nature of it. So I'm really worried about options like that's happened in the UK of moving small claims onto purely paper-based determinations. I think that misses out on what is vital in that human dynamic. But I think we are going to have to do some radical things. So we tolerate a degree of rough and ready justice in the criminal sphere that we just don't tolerate in the civil sphere. We talk about magistrates with 200 to 300 listings in a day. In the criminal sphere, we perhaps need to be better at recognizing that some civil justice just needs to get before a court and get a determination, even if it's a little bit rough and ready. And that's going to entail huge cultural shifts and a tolerance of imperfection that is not reflective of how we tend to approach civil justice at the moment.
Thank you so much, Joe. That's really helpful.
Okay, further questions? Well, while you might be formulating a question in your mind, either to put in the chat or to speak out loud, perhaps I could pose one to the two justices and ask each of you perhaps in turn to just imagine if you're the Attorney General for the day, or alternatively had a magic wand, what is the one key reform that you would implement in order to improve access to justice in your respective jurisdictions?
If I can start, Alistair, while I have no ambition to be Attorney General for a day or for any length of time, I do think that one solution, it's an old-fashioned solution to improve legal aid, is to have the legal aid budget as a fixed percentage of the budget of the Department of Justice and Attorney General. This is done in jurisdictions in other places, and the way in which it works on the minds of those who propose spending in that department is that it's most unusual for a department to say we want less money, so that there will be, by a fixed percentage being applied, a reasonable likelihood, and I put it no higher than that, that the amount for legal aid will increase. And any judicial officer will tell you that one of the hardest parts of the job is dealing with litigants in person. They come along and they have cases sometimes that have no merits, but come along with cases that you can see have merits, but they simply can't put them into words. And if there was a better legal aid system on the civil side, then that could be done. It would save so much court time because these matters take a much longer period of time to deal with unrepresented people. So if I have a magic wand or a day in which I'm king of the Attorney General's department, that's what I'd do.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Glenn. And Jenny, I wonder whether you might have something to do with your magic.
No magic wands, really. I really liked that answer about sort of structuring things differently so that there was an appropriate budget for civil in legal aid. So I don't know that I could suggest anything better. I concur with Justice Martin. I couldn't suggest anything better than that. I'd not really read the questions. I don't think I could suggest it. Just the whole system needs so many more resources which is a sort of horrible answer because everybody knows that there's not a lot of money to go around. But I think some of the experienced lawyers, even from private practice that have done a lot of civil work, you know, if they were to spend some time even embedded in the legal aid offices to help these solicitors that are there do some of the more routine matters quickly, then that might assist. I was thinking more in terms of say my usual customers in Alice Springs, everybody who's to appear before a court used to be medically and psychologically assessed so we could start dealing with them appropriately really quickly. Just save resources further down the track.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that, Jenny. Any other questions from the audience? I can propose one more and perhaps direct this one to Lisa. And before we do that, we'll pass over to Matt, who's got his hand up.
Thanks, Alistair. I was just waiting to see if anyone else was going to ask one. Look, I noticed that your chapter is about politics and the interaction between politics and the court, which is something that really interests me. And I wonder if, I think probably most people in this audience and most people in academia are pretty critical of mandatory sentencing reform. But I wondered if you could comment on the interaction between, legislature and courts, and if there are, this is just a question from ignorance, if there are better models for how we could have a more democratic interaction with courts rather than some of the restraints that are being put on courts at the moment.
Yeah, one of the key challenges is that elected representatives need to be representative of their electorates and express that mood of their electorates within the parliament. But there is some of that conflict and the controversy that comes through about what is right and what might be expected. Whether there's a perfect model, though, remains to be seen. That's one of the challenges, I guess. And particularly when there are certain high-profile cases which are going to dominate the public discourse, they'll, by virtue of that, will ooze their way into the halls of the chambers of the parliament and then out again. Is there a perfect model? Perhaps not, but I'm wondering whether one of the justices might be able to add to that from the perspective of the bench.
The short answer is no. This is a debate or an area of conflict which has existed for a long time. And the relationship between the courts and Parliament or legislators is a fraught one. And it's far too big an area to be answered tonight from me, at any rate. The approach that is taken in Australia is a conservative one, and I think it will remain so while we have the parliamentary and constitutional system we have, with in the Commonwealth a strict division of power and in the states a de facto division of power.
Yeah, so I think one thing that we can be particularly grateful for here in Australia is the non-party political nature of the appointment of justices, as we've been seeing, Joe, in the last 24 hours, and the controversy over whether somebody is acting on pure base partisan positioning as opposed to what is right before the law.
Can I just add to that, Alistair? Today, there are articles popping up all over the place about the recent election for the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. Not something I always pay attention to, but the articles are remarkable for the way in which they say, hooray, the Liberals now have a 4-3 majority on the court. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're a Liberal or a Conservative. That's a bad thing, I think, to say, to have that American approach to identify people so closely with a particular cause. But that system isn't going to change in that country.
We, Jenny, we have historically bumped up a bit with our comments, would be a bit sharper in those areas where the legislature has really gone into an area that we hold for ourselves as the judiciary, such as mandatory sentencing, mandatory imprisonment, you know. I mean, I'm not settled on what the best approach is. And in fact, a lot of our mandatory imprisonment sections are being in the process of being repealed now, which I see as positive. But I think various of the judicial officers in the NT have, you know, in judgments or when sentencing people, made comments and everything. But I don't know if it helps. So I do see that as an intrusion into our role, and that maybe one of the responses could be in judgments to point out how unjust it is. But I'm not convinced that it helps. So that's in that very sort of acute area, I suppose.
Perhaps just in our last remaining minute or so, we've got one question posed by Linda in the chat, Linda Ryle. Do either of the justices have a comment to make in relation to the adequate, or not so, of culturally principled practice evidenced by the legal practitioners that appear before them?
Well, it varies, of course, according to people's exposure, perhaps where they were brought up. You know, we have, I mean, just as an example, I mean, sometimes newish defence lawyers in the Northern Territory will get up and say, you know, horror of horrors, this person was brought up by their auntie and uncle, not their real parents, whereas, you know, culturally in the kinship system, that's something that is very usual in traditionally focused societies. So I think it varies. I often find that people who are new to the Northern Territory with all the good intentions just make certain assumptions that I think if you've had some introduction either to perhaps Indigenous languages or some other form of important cultural matter, you might not be making those assumptions.
So far as my court is concerned, I really can't assist. The area in which I usually sit does not, these issues don't arise. It's more something that would be within the purview, certainly of district court and the magistrates court, but it's not something that arises in the way the question highlights in the area in which I sit.
Jackie might have a good insight into that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Your Honours. I suppose I can only speak from the perspective of a clerk of chambers and someone who's spent time in multiple courts in multiple states over many years, I think most people do their best with what, as you mentioned, with what they might know or what they might have been able to glean. But there are frequent instances where there is, I'll call it insensitivity is perhaps best. I don't think it's always deliberate. I think sometimes it's just the effect of busyness and courts being noisy, busy, and not always the most hospitable of places. I think there's been considerable effort made by multiple courts in both New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, and I'm of no doubt the Northern Territory as well, to assist Indigenous people when they appear before courts with necessary accommodations related to culture, and the creation of the Koori Court in New South Wales and the other specialist courts has certainly assisted in that. I think that my experience of practitioners is there is a wide variety of practitioners. Some come from a generation where cultural accommodation was not language that they were used to using, but certainly younger practitioners and younger barristers that I work with regularly have an incredible sensitivity and consideration, and many of them themselves come from culturally diverse backgrounds, and so they really are fantastic at doing their utmost to accommodate the needs of clients, you know, be they Indigenous or be they from another Australian cultural group. But, you know, we can always do better, I think, as a profession, and certainly, you know, in my small way, I try to make sure that anyone that comes to our chambers or anyone that's in any of our matters that we deal with, that, you know, all of my staff are appropriately briefed and the barristers are appropriately briefed on any cultural considerations that might be relevant. But it's incremental change like it is in the general population. I think when, you know, as the profession changes, it becomes more broad in the cultural, racial, gender sense, and more diverse. These things will become more easier for us to incorporate.
Terrific. Thanks for that, Jackie. And now back to you, Marg, to finalise proceedings.
Terrific. Thank you, everyone, for coming along, and thank you sincerely to our speakers, Justice Martin, Justice Blokland, Lisa and Joe, and to all of the contributors who were able to make it here tonight, and to everyone else who came along because of your interest in this book. Thank you also to Kyle for manning the stations and the chat and the technology that kept going, thankfully, despite some of the issues that can happen. Don't forget that there is a discount code. I think Alistair's popped that in the chat already. That will last, I think, for about a month if you'd like to purchase the book in either ebook form or hard copy, and so on. I think that's it, Alistair.
Yes, I think that's it.
Yeah, thanks very much, and have a good night, everybody.